So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to OpenUK's Show and Tell with a special focus on AI today. I am absolutely delighted that we have the content that we're going to be sharing with you this afternoon. Our Show and Tell has been going for almost 3 years now, and it's a way to bring together people who are doing research around the opens and to enable them to share across the community the work they're doing. We'll allow each of the 3 speakers to spend sort of 15, 20 minutes sharing their work, and then we will open it up to audience questions. We have a hard stop for everyone at 5:30 UK in 90 minutes time, or 85 minutes time, since we're starting a few minutes late. The session is being recorded, so if you put any questions in the chat, if you don't want to ask yourself, if you want to ask questions, we'll bring you on screen. And we have some really superb content coming your way today. The report that Andreas and Mark have worked on in the Netherlands was published about a month ago now, and it frankly was one of the best pieces of work that I had seen. I was absolutely delighted to see it and to run into Andreas at AI Dev in Paris. So I had actually been sitting in a room where we were talking about AI, and I put my hand up and suggested that the person who was giving the presentation ought to read the new Dutch report. And Andreas turned around and asked me which report I was talking about. And he said, oh, I wrote it. So we're really fortunate that this happenstance happened. And we were able to bring Andreas to talk to you about it today. And we'll kick him off in just a second. He's going to be followed by Aviya Skowron, who I met after the AI Safety Institute event in November in the UK. And Aviya was one of the people who was able to participate in that event representing open source. And there weren't so many people there doing that. So the content that they're going to bring to this today, I think, is extraordinarily credible. And it's really important to have their voice here. So I'm delighted to welcome them also. And they're going to talk about the Mozilla convening, and the Mozilla convening through Columbia, the Columbia convening, which we're aware of, and the data convening, which is not yet published. So real cutting edge stuff. And then our very own Dr. Jennifer Barth is going to join and take you through the report update that we did last week for OpenUK. So really fantastic content coming your way this afternoon. A quick reminder that everybody's attendance is subject to the OpenUK Code of Respect and our competition policy. You can find those following these links. And that we have a summer picnic on Sunday if anybody would like to join us and hasn't had the opportunity yet. Also, to find out about future events, whether it's the show and tells, digital events, or in-person events that we organise, or even just things like a report, please do sign up to our newsletter. And final save the date, 20th of September for the next show and tell. Content will be shared over the summer. And Tuesday, the 17th of September for an open data meetup in London. We will also be having meetups rolling out across the UK in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Bristol, and Cardiff in September. So back to the subject at hand. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Andreas. Now, Andreas, I'm going to say this wrong, and I probably said it wrong at our report launch last week. Lisenfeld.
Lisenfeld.
Lisenfeld. Knew I'd get it wrong. So assistant professor at Radboud University. He researches societal and regulatory implications of emerging language technologies. And of course, the thing that brought me to his technology report on open source was the headline, Open Washing in AI. And for anybody who's not aware, the AI Act was shared this morning by the EU, and we may also see if Andreas has read it and pick his brains at the end of the session on that. So Andreas, without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and enable you to share yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. And thank you, Amanda, for this opportunity to show and tell you a little bit about our project called Opening Up ChatGPT. So this is something we initiated around a year ago after ChatGPT was released and was a very successful product. And our problem with it is that it wasn't open enough, right? So we were looking immediately for more open alternatives to ChatGPT. Last but not least, in teaching at public institutions, at public universities, for instance, in my case, where we wanted to make sure that we're using the most open and the most transparent piece of technology of this type. And of this type means the instruction-tuned LLMs, right? So the instruction-following chatbots that became very popular with the release of ChatGPT. So what we did is we went looking for all those models that build themselves as open source, right, or as open. And we found that there's quite a number of technologies. It's a very fast-changing field, right? So we saw a lot of movement of a lot of organizations and companies getting into that space and releasing similar types of technologies. And so the problem immediately was that a lot of them released one specific part of their technology, which is the weights, the model weights, under a license which is traditionally an open source license, right? So a type of license which fulfills the traditional criteria of what is defined as open source. And so our problem with this was that this is really just releasing, looking at the weights, is just one slice of this technology. That wasn't enough for us. So we wanted to get a better picture of what happens before you arrive at the weights, right? So what happens in the training process, what happens with all the data, what happens with all different types of access, of how I can interact with this type of technology. And yeah, so we wanted to look beyond just what is now called open weight only, right? So that was the issue, that lots of organizations and companies were billing themselves as more open as they actually are, and open actually in most cases only applied to one specific piece, and that is the weights. So here is what we found, right? So we found all these technologies, and so what you see here in one row is one model or one system by a certain organization. And if I scroll so slowly down and up here, you can see that this list has been growing. So we arrived at like now 40 plus instruction-tuned LLMs, and there's really a lot of them. And they come in varying degrees of openness, right? So if you look across each row here, you will see we have boxes which can either be red or orange or green, right? So that refers to a 3-level openness judgment, right? Which is either open, partially open, or closed. And these judgments come in a variety of different, what we call openness dimensions, in 3 groups related to availability of this technology, of the system, related to documentation of how it was built and how it was trained, and related to access, which are different modes of how you can interact with this technology as either an end user or a builder or a tinkerer or a hobbyist or a student. And so I'm going to walk you through these different 14 dimensions of openness that we looked at when we examined each one of these instruction-tuned LLMs, or instruction-tuned models. And so I'm going to start all the way at the bottom. So you see they're roughly listed. So we have weighted these scores here. And so now they're roughly listed according to how open this technology is. So these ones you see here on the top end are the most open instruction-tuned LLMs. And if I scroll further down, you see that some of them are really not as open. So, and all the way at the bottom, for reference purposes, is the one which is the original perpetrator of overselling themselves as very open, and that is by OpenAI, the original ChatGPT, which is, as you can see, not very open at all. And most openness dimensions here remain completely closed. So very little is known, for instance, what code specifically was used to train these models, what LLM data was used. So here we have taken a view of at least covering 2 types of data. So here the training pipelines for these technologies can be very long and involving many different steps of how data is involved for training one model first, something we call a base model, and then fine-tuning or further instruction tuning these models in different steps. So what we did here to break this down into a kind of a manageable division is we looked at the base LLM data. So that is the base model data to train the what's sometimes called a foundation model underlying that the technology. So this is the base or foundation model data, and this is the base or foundation model weights. And then RL refers to reinforcement learning. So this is one or multiple steps which involve various reinforcement learning techniques, which enable the typical ChatGPT instruction following behavior, right? Where you can interact and you can ask that model or give that model in a rather complicated or rather long prompt, and it can then try to follow these instructions that it's given. So here we look then at this the data that specifically was used for the fine-tuning or instruct tuning steps for this part, and then the weights of the final instruction tuned model. And then next comes the documentation part. So there we looked at licenses. So licenses is all licenses used in all different parts of these models and how they were built, right? So this would be licenses of the data sets that are being used, the licenses of the code that is used to do the training of the training pipeline, and then licenses of the final product. So these are multiple licenses typically that we looked at. And then code is availability and the documentation of that code that is used. So is it just production ready, let's say production code, right? Or is this actually built in a way that enables easy access for outsiders and to comprehend how that code is organized and maybe to edit or tinker with that code, right? So that is scientific documentation of code. And then third is the documentation of the architecture, of the computing architecture. So what hardware was used, what GPUs or what supercomputers were involved in training, how long did it take, how many resources were used, and so forth and so on. And then next is preprint. So whether or not there is a preprint release documenting this technology and this model in sufficient detail. And then accordingly, if this is also published as a scientific paper or not. So the difference between the preprint only and the paper comes down to the peer review process, right? So whether or not there was a peer-reviewed publication describing this technology or not. And then next we looked at model cards and data sheets, which are also important sources of information to learn more about what data went into these models and what do we know about how it was built. All right, so these are two types, the model cards and the data sheets. We looked at whether or not they exist. And last but not least, two modes of access. So whether or not this model has been released as a package on a package repository such as PyP or similar, and whether or not there is an API available where end users can interact with the model, and how this API is managed, how open it is, or whether it is for commercial purposes only, and so forth and so on. So now scrolling back up, you can see the field has been changing incredibly fast, right? So these top couple of models here, they're all not very old, and they're all rather quite open, not fully open yet, but there's been a lot of movement, and we really see there's an incredible amount of work which goes into building these types of technologies. Okay, so what you're looking at right now is the front end of our project. So I want to also quickly show you the back end of this opening up ChatGPT project, because what we imagined when we started building this is a community platform and an open information source on openness of this type of technology, which everybody can contribute to, right? So here is the final product, the final list, which is a living list, right? It's a list that can be updated in real time, and then this website would be updated. And everybody can do these updates by going to the GitHub repository, which is linked here, where you can find the data backend of all the data that goes into this table. And there, every user can provide suggestions for adding a new model, and then also can provide evidence-based judgments and links to information sources of how open each of these dimensions are. Because if you click on each of these boxes, right, so each of these little boxes here is actually a link which brings you to some source of information where you can learn more about this specific dimension of openness. So if I click, for instance, here on open code of this almost 7B instruct model by LNAI, I straight away, I hope you're following on your screen, I straight away get taken to the source of where this information comes from and where you can learn about specifically the code that was used to build this specific model. So all of these boxes serve as links, which can be edited. They can be edited by everyone. So this is an open project hosted on GitHub. And now this is the backend of opening up ChatGPT. And here, you find that actually underlying this live table is a list of YAML files here, which can be edited by everybody. So they can be downloaded. So you can open each of these data tables and you can fill in more information. You can fill in links, and you can create your own. There's a little guide of how to do that and how to open your own, how to add your own project to this list, and then supply information about all 14 dimensions of openness. And once you've done that, filled out this little template here, you could save it, and then afterwards, if you go back to the live table, so if I go back here and then I go back to that table should automatically update itself, and you will see that we end up with well, a new row on this list here, so everybody can chip in on keeping this list up to date and making sure all the information is not only accurate but also open for criticism and open for live updates should the situation change. So we had situations already of existing models where suddenly one additional piece of a technology became suddenly open or was opened up, and then this table would update in real time, and the position in the ranking, for instance, would change. All right, so on this list, you can also find a little bit more information about our other work, about other papers that we've been writing on this topic. The latest one being this one here, which just came out a couple of months ago on rethinking open source generative AI, open washing, and the EU AI Act. So this one is our first piece of work, more specifically related to openness definitions and what we feel is an issue surrounding open washing related to the EU AI Act, as this is now taking its final shape and coming into force soon. But yeah, so this is what I want to show you. So if you are interested in that, please have a look at this website at opening-up-chatgpt.github.io. And that is all for me. I will try to stop sharing my screen now. Yeah, and here I am, back. Hello?
You're back. Hello. So just touching base with the room to see if we have any questions, if anybody wants to jump on screen and ask their questions. Mark, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit slow in Google Meet. I don't use it as much as the other ones. Anyway, yeah, thanks very much. I was just wondering what criteria is or guidelines or framework there is for helping judge helping judge the evaluations in each area you mentioned. Is there some sort of guideline to that to make sure people are, kind of following some sort of standard?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So as far as I know, and so when we entered this field, was relatively early, about a year ago, there has not been a definitive guideline of you have to look at, let's say, 16, 14, 15 dimensions, right? So the specific number of what defines openness in the open source AI space, right, is really something which, as far as I understand, is still up in the air, right? So this is something to be discussed. And it might well be that some people have a little bit of a different understanding and, for instance, say, well, preprint is okay for me, I don't need a paper, right? So if it just comes down to, like, is a scientific paper required, or is just releasing a preprint with some information good enough? Sure, you can have a debate on specific dimensions and the number of them and the specific division of them, but I think what it comes down to is that I would contend that it's actually very hard to pin this down and say, here are the 14 definitive ones, or here are the 16 definitive ones. So there will always be a little bit of room. And there are some issues with that, right? So this kind of problem of hammering down one specific definition, this is openness in open source AI, is something you need, for instance, for regulatory purposes. And that is exactly where the EU AI comes in, right? So there you need a clear definition, and you need to define a cutoff point. So our work is really not doing that, right? We're not defining the cutoff point, but we're doing some more like groundwork, underlying, okay, so giving a survey, so to speak, of that landscape, and then where people want to define the cutoff of what they think is a true openness and what is not true open anymore, is down to individual use cases, let's say.
So you would say that this is a way of looking at each aggregated component and its potential for openness, as opposed to saying what makes an AI or a model or an LLM open or not.
Exactly. So I know I can maybe also point, Mark, to the AI deep dive by an organization called the OSI, right, the Open Source Initiative, which has traditionally been influential in defining what is open and what is not, and then defining licenses.
Andreas, I'm going to jump in here. So the OSI is a bit more specific than that. The OSI is the custodian of the open source definition for open source software. And they've only historically defined open source software, which is part of the challenge we had as AI came along, where it potentially was broader and had other components. So there's only one definition, and that's for open source software. And that's part of the challenge that AI's brought us. Sorry.
Absolutely, this is what I was going to get to. So then this organization has initiated this AI deep dive to really update their definitions to the age of open source AI, also now aiming to cover this type of technology, which they're struggling with. This is it's been a long process, and we'll have to wait and see what's the outcome of that, but it's certainly hard for those who try to come up with that kind of clear definition.
Yeah, okay. No, because if it's like meant to help lay a foundation for judging, openness in a way that could challenge open washing, as the phrase was there, yeah, of course there needs to be some sort of parameters around that, and also because I'm really interested in ethical use of AI along with everything else in open source. So ethics is really important to me. The fact is that, some sort of standards for guiding people towards something that feels ethical in terms of being open, means that probably there would be some sort of definitions, however loose they might be. So it might be, if you put this out for surveys and so on, it might be good at the same time to elicit any comments from people about their view on how they see openness. And maybe that gives you some crowd sourcing approach to looking at what are the most important things to people to judge openness. But I'm sure there's been some other areas around this. I'll check, because I have some friends who've been doing stuff more with the UN and similar organizations.
So Mark,
you might have had a stab at this anyway.
Mark, there's a couple of things in what you said there. So one thing that open source does not do as open source software is judge anything ethically. Yes, so if there are any restrictions, of course, that stops it.
It's our choice to do
so that. We leave it, we leave it to the regulators really to judge ethics and morals, and open source is available to everybody for any purpose they want to use it for. Yeah. And the UN had an exercise in May where what they did was have a governance day with the ITU in Geneva. So that's sort of where they're at on it. There's not a formal statement or anything from them yet. I think that the key here is the open washing piece, Andreas, at least for me. And it's when you want to understand what is being exempted, and I haven't been the whole way through the AI Act yet. I don't know if you have. When you are looking at that, you don't have a definition there that goes enough, and maybe there is in this version, into what open source means, yet you exempt it from the regulation. And I think that's the key, is to understand what it is that's being exempted. And of course, drilling down into that, is it something that's defined, or is it something where we look at each criteria? And certainly here in the UK, when I talk to policymakers, I'm encouraging them to look at each component part and to get transparency, to actually understand what it is. Is it fully open? Is it partially open? Is it closed? Which components are they? And what does that mean in terms of risks and benefits? And of course, how do you want to regulate that? And do you want to do it differently? So Andreas,
Absolutely.
I don't know if you had a chance to look at the Act at all.
I did have a quick look. I did not finish it. It's not something you can finish in the off evening hours. But yeah, I just wanted to go back to Mark and really say, you're spot on. This is I couldn't agree more that we need a community-driven sort of, ideally a community-driven definition which lives up to the task, right? Where many people have a say and many stakeholders are involved. And that's exactly how we see our work, as something which hopefully is useful for those in this space, as an open platform of information where people can look up specific openness data points that are interested to them. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much. I know there are a lot of associations. The UN has an association of open source and ethics, so everybody kind of builds these things. And of course, that's the wider context I'm merely trying to place this in. Of course, it's, matters differently to different people. But
brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. And Andreas, do we have any more questions for Andreas just before we wrap up? I'm conscious we started slightly late, so he is getting us back on time. Okay, great. Well, Andreas, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to sharing the video afterwards. I really appreciate your time today. Excellent.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And we should just actually credit your co-author, Mark, who hasn't been able to join us today. So moving on to our next speaker, Aviya Skowron, who is the head of policy and ethics at Eleuther AI. As I say, somebody who was at the AI Safety Summit last November and really has been representing open source in many of the discussions across this. I think also involved a bit in deep dive. So Aviya, we're really looking forward to hear what you have to say today. Can we just check, if I stop sharing, that you are able to share your screen simply and easily?
Okay, perfect. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Aviya. I'm head of policy at Eleuther AI. I will be focusing on sort of two projects that are really about movement building and gathering momentum and consensus around certain key issues in the open source AI space and its margins. As we've already touched, that this is difficult to define, or sort of it's difficult to draw a boundary, right? You will see this reappearing as I'm going sort of through these two related, but the projects are at different stages. Let's put it this way. And just to sort of cover where we are sitting in this. So both the Columbia convening on openness in AI and the dataset workshop, the dataset convening that just happened in Amsterdam in June, they were hosted by Mozilla with another organization. The Columbia convening was Mozilla and the Columbia Institute of Global Politics. And the Amsterdam convening was Mozilla and us. Both meetings involved dozens of experts and many known open-ish AI organizations such as Hugging Face, Meta, Cohere for AI, but also civil society organizations like CET, OSI. So I cannot speak for all of the participants, especially any mistakes. Please attribute them to me. I'll do my best to sort of present the consensus, but I will be diving more into what our contributions were to those two projects, and to what my area of focus is, which is policy. And if you don't know what Eleuther AI is, we are a nonprofit that grew out of a community of researchers that convene on Discord. We have a Discord server. You may know us from our model suite, Aviya, or from GPTJ, from one of our many papers, or from our code bases like LM Evil Harness, which is quite widely used. So, the Columbia convening happened at the end of February. The initial spark for it, actually, I'm glad, Amanda, you brought up the UK summit, because just before the summit there was an open letter, a joint letter on openness in AI and sort of the value of that open AI models bring to the table. And that was really sort of the first moment where we saw multiple groups with a stake in open models gathering and sort of trying to find a voice. So following, and if, as you'll probably remember, there's a reason for this, because a lot of the conversation around AI policy is driven by closed models. And there is still less now, but especially around the UK Safety Summit, there was a lot of fear and frankly fear-mongering around open models. You know, what happens if you release the model weights? So the Columbia convening was special because this was an opportunity to have an internal discussion, as opposed to being the one person on the panel that has to represent all of the open space. This was sort of like 40 people who already work in this space, trying to work out what are the common issues that we see nowadays. There is a paper following the Columbia convening called "Towards a Framework for Openness in Foundation Models." It's 27 pages. I cannot possibly summarize it all, so I decided to focus on sort of what I see as the main theme that emerged for me and was really the center of my discussion, both leading up to that. I was in the working group that sort of prepared the background documents for the Columbia convening. During the day, we really tried to zoom in on understanding the entire technology stack that is built around open models. So the core theme of our discussion was that it's not just the model. There are many attempts to sort of like list all the components. The Columbia convening, the goal here was to be expansive, to really think through like not just what needs to be there, but what are possibly the farthest reaches of the technology stack. So we go from hardware to the user interface. The reason I think this is important is because it has policy implications. So specifically what I mean here is that you can see how certain policy interventions, they are not in the tech stack itself, they can apply to many layers. And this is important for public policy, for example, because it affects how you draft legislation, or ideally how you would draft legislation, let me put it this way. The idea here is that if we have this decentralized open system, we need to have very, one, it helps if we have clear expectations regarding who can do what. Two, we need to be able to communicate it to the outside world that is used to a centralized model where you have one company that does the entirety of the work. From they own their infrastructure as opposed to renting it. They collect their data. They do the entire data pipeline in-house. They have their own internal libraries that are probably based on open source libraries, but nonetheless, they're kept in-house. Then they train their own model on their own architecture, and they serve this model via API and other ways of delivering it to customers. And they might offer fine-tuning services, but again, they don't release the model. They take your data and then give you access to the fine-tuned model, right? So because this is the default, this is sort of like what the world hears about when they read about this technology. People have a very different view of what it means to have a model and to make it. So the Columbia convening really drilled down on like just how many components there are in the stack and how different potential safeguards and interventions, how they interact with that stack. So that's sort of my key takeaway from that convening. Now, the dataset convening, which happened in June and where we were, which we were co-hosting, is following up on that work. So as you see, Mozilla is sort of bringing people together in order to give more of a, be a face and be a platform to have those intra-movement, open movement conversations around AI. We were co-hosting the convening because we are currently in the process of developing an open data set. And what I mean by an open data set is that it's composed of public domain data that was not covered by copyright in the first place, such as government data, which doesn't get copyright protections, and open access content that has already been published on the internet under an open access license. So for example, open access archive papers. This is ongoing work, so there's no equivalent of this table yet for the dataset convening, but there will be in a month or so. Now, my opinion is that with when it comes to open models, just as a subject, there we sort of just have a political situation where there's, or at least in 2023, there was actually lobbying against open source AI models. There was just a need to articulate, to forcefully and clearly articulate that, open models exist. We're not all just dangerous, anonymous users of the internet. There are serious organizations involved, and we are collectively thinking through, things like technical mitigations, ethical interventions. It's not a Wild West. So this was sort of in my opinion only, this is actually an easier problem than what is happening in the open data space. The open data space, I think, has more significant challenges to clear in order to advance and contribute to the general open technology movement. So now I want to just spend time on unpacking that statement and unpacking the sentences I have on the screen to explain what I mean exactly. And all of this is based in our lessons taken like specifically from the experience of building the common file. So here it says that building and releasing an open access dataset is a complex technological and legal problem that requires deep collaboration expertise. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean that, for example, if you're trying to ensure that that a given piece of content is under a specific license, in order for this to make sense, remotely make sense legally, your code has to preserve the version of the license. So sort of one of the problems we encountered is that many code bases, identify that something is CC BY, and in the processing, they strip the fact that it's 4.0 or 3.5. You think that this is code-wise, this is a minor problem, but it is actually a very big combined legal, policy, and technical challenge to make sure that the legal analysis matches what the code is actually doing. Because the expertise is just so rare. And this is what I mean by deep collaboration expertise. We need sort of multiple people who have one leg in one world and another leg in the other world in order for someone to make the connections between, what the legal theory is and what is the result of our computation, essentially. Now, the collection, identification, and validation of a large-scale open access data set calls for substantial amounts of manual artisanal work. Here, what I mean is that, for example, we may have records that indicate that a book should be public domain. However, did you know that ISBN numbers were only introduced in the 70s? So identifiers for particular works vary by data set, even for works registered with the US Copyright Office, which is what we rely on for some copyright information. So this means that there needs to be a lot of just plainly manual verification of the data. And we are dealing with a lot of data, as you probably know. Like we're talking about like millions of data points, so we have to sample randomly and try to identify like what are the issues that we're seeing and how can we address them. Consultations with legal experts. That is related to the first sentence, right? That we need both the coders and the lawyers, and they need to be communicating. They need to be communicating on a regular basis in order for this to work at all. An additional challenge is that because we are dealing with copyright law, we need to be sensitive to jurisdiction. I'd like to highlight, for example, that currently the US and UK are sorry, not UK. That is true, but I actually don't know UK copyright law well enough to speak on this, but the EU is currently in a different legal regime than the US with regards to copyright law and AI training. I'm referring here to the text and data mining exception. So decision making is also very difficult in the open space because, as you know, it's sort of like, I mean, maybe your open source projects are more tightly run, but most open source projects are not very tightly run. They rely on volunteers. There's not much of a top-down control of what everyone is doing. But in order to make decisions driven by legal analysis by jurisdiction, you need that top-down control. So on top of that, here, there's a disadvantage to trying to be open and collaborative about this. Because sometimes you just want that level of control that you're never going to get in an open environment. And it's not that we would like it to have it in the open environment. We don't. We like doing things the open source way. But I'm highlighting how, again, open data sets are a whole other level of challenge to just sort of like the conversation around open models. And the last bit that I would like to highlight on the point about technological skill is that in order to the purely identifying whether a given piece of content is the content that is supposed to be covered by a license is sometimes non-trivial. So what I mean by this is, for example, when you filter the common crawl, it is very easy to filter for websites that link to, say, a Creative Commons license. Just my last point was on the fact that it's very easy to filter for websites that have some sort of a Creative Commons statement attached to them, but it's exceedingly difficult to identify what content that statement refers to. Because when you look at the HTML, fundamentally, whether the Creative Commons license refers to an image on the website or the text on the website, it looks the same. So while it's very easy to identify that there is some sort of Creative Commons thing at a given URL, it is very difficult to make sure that we are gathering the right data, because we're an LLM data set, so we are interested in text data. So I hope this sort of sketches the landscape of issues associated with open data sets, which of course are still very exciting from the perspective of the open movement, but I think I'm done and we can go to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Super interesting. It's an interesting thing where you start to look at the topics like, you mentioned public domain and scraping, where different jurisdictions have got different rules about it. And here in the UK, we don't have public domain. And who knows what the rules are on scraping right now. I think that's one of the big asks that we're pushing the government on, is to make a decision as a new government about whether or not text and data mining can happen here in the UK. If you were looking at that from the perspective of the data convening, is there anything that you would specifically ask the UK government? Is there anything we can learn from it that we should be including in those conversations?
Oh, well, first of all, get on top of this, because this is an actually hard problem. So there needs to be a lot of energy dedicated towards it. One note, if you go with text and data, like EU-style text and data mining exception, it's been law since 2019, but yet still a workable technical implementation of it does not exist. Like a machine readable standard for robots. There are proposed standards, and to some extent, robots.txt covers that area, but it's not sufficient. So once again, the sooner you get on the problem, the better. But now there's because of the EU AI Act, there's a lot of energy to have a TDM functioning TDM opt-out, because the EU AI Act reinforces that the TDM exception applies. So using crawl data is actually permitted in the EU as long as the copyright holder has a way of meaningfully opting out of the text and data mining.
How is that being implemented practically? Do we know? The opt-out?
Yes, so there's a very good brief from Open Future that's sort of the cutting edge of this. The commission is not leading the work. The sort of companies need to step up. Robots.txt is one version of it, but on top of that, there are currently being developed sort of unit-based approaches. And what I mean by this is that robots.txt is location-based. It's at the URL location. Unit-based would correspond more closely to something like a work, like a given piece of text, or let's say an image. So that's currently being implemented, or sort of like worked on. And the brief is Paul Keller at Open Future wrote it. I don't remember the title.
Yeah, and how do you, I'm not the world's biggest fan of a lot of stuff being left to the companies, right? And I think an awful lot of stuff has been left to companies to create standards and then to do it through standards bodies, which you can only really access if you have money, skills, and time, which the open source community struggles with or has historically. You know, we don't have the money to do all of this stuff. We don't necessarily have representation that is deeply skilled in it and can go and sit in all of these meetings. Do you know what the process there will be? Will it be a formal standards process, or is it just going to be industry saying this is what we're doing?
So once again, the problem with the division of labor between government and industry is that government frequently just plainly does not have the hours and the expertise and the political force to make the kind of investment that would be necessary to do the job well. Wow, I'm starting to sound like an annoying libertarian. I sincerely apologize. I just mean from observation. These are actually genuinely big challenges, and what happens in practice is they do get like punted to the companies. I think with the TVM exception specifically, the one saving grace is that from the publisher's perspective, which are like on the other side of this issue, they do want the standards to be as broad and applicable as possible, because that's the intention. So there's some political will towards it being, the system being interoperable and something that anyone can plug into. Will that happen? I cannot guarantee that it will happen. But I think it has a decent chance of happening. More decent than just like if you were relying on goodwill and how things typically go.
Do we have any more questions? Everybody's going quiet. It's very late in the day here. Thank you. I think that's super interesting, really helpful to get that deep dive into the data perspective. And I'm going to just offer up the opportunity before we move over to Jen. If anybody on the call wants to ask any questions of either Andreas or Aviya, I'm sort of appreciative of the fact that some people will drop off possibly before 5:30. So we have a final few minutes if anybody has any. Otherwise, I think what we've seen today is really... Oh, Marion, go on.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So I had a question just about the kind of provision of that open data that you're then scraping, because I work at an 360 Giving, which is an open data standard in the UK that encourages grant makers to publish open data about their grants. And so they're required to publish under an open license, and they can choose, if it's Creative Commons or Open Government license, whatever they want. But a lot of the understanding among the publishers is really low, and so like quite often we'll find that they've blocked our crawlers that download the data every night and make it available in a search engine, and they kind of don't realize that part of sharing open data is that you have to let even machines read it. And so yeah, I wonder, like, is that a thing for us? It's kind of a constant issue that we're having to send people emails being like, oh, we couldn't access your data. So even with all the goodwill in the world, there's like a kind of, I guess, like a tech literacy issue that they kind of don't realize that that's an essential component of their data being open. And I wonder, I don't know, for us it's quite hard work maintaining just like a few hundred publishers of open data, sharing data just about grants. But do you find that with all of the data sets that are available, that they're just constantly sort of like, disappearing or no longer being accessible? And yeah, because for us, it's a big curation exercise, basically, getting that open data to remain open.
Yeah, so unfortunately, currently, I think it's like even worse. And I'm sorry to say that. Yeah. And I do think that it's a result of the backlash against generative AI, right? Which is still very annoying to very many people. Sometimes doesn't, the use cases are not very maybe well thought out. Let's put it this way. So what we actually see in our data, and there's actually going to be a paper coming out very soon that quantifies this across C4 and the Dolma dataset, that many more people, like web domains, started opting out of the common crawler, for example, following the release of Chat GPT, even though OpenAI has its own crawler that you have to block. But sort of the backlash, like the backlash is hitting everyone. And who's hurting it the most? It's actually the academics who rely on the common crawl, because the purpose of the common crawl is that people don't have to be running their own crawls. It saves, it's beneficial to the researchers, it's beneficial to general web traffic. And it's also just, it's not, you need to have very narrow expertise in order to like be doing something like what common crawl is doing. And unfortunately, more and more web domains are opting out. I think that like one of the reasons we want to do the common pile is to just sort of, one, demonstrate some sort of goodwill from the AI side of things, to see what is the best that we can do. But I fully agree that all the incentives are to close the data. Also because opening data opens you up legally, basically. Like you're just assuming legal risk, and you really have to have strong reasons in order to want to do that. So yes, and it's worse is my answer, and I'm sorry that that's the report.
Yeah. I mean, it's risky, and also because of the experiences that people have had with generative AI, like hallucinating or just producing inaccurate things, there's this like fear that getting your data consumed by AI will misrepresent you or make you look bad in some way, and in some cases that has happened. Thank you.
Andreas, did you want to add anything into that conversation? Then we've got time for one more quick question from Mark. Mark, do you want to jump in? But if we can keep it short, please. Thank you.
I do. Sorry, actually, it was just more of a comment. So just quickly, it wasn't the UN, but it's actually OECD, which has been doing more work into what constitutes trustworthy AI and the metrics involved. And I know that's sort of outside openness, but it is sort of joined up with that and some of the UN goals. So I can put a link to that if it's helpful in the just to
thank you.
It wasn't the UN, sorry. I'll be really interested in the next. I have these co-production meetings with the Turing Institute, and we've been looking a lot at the issues facing open research. As mentioned in the last talk, I'm going to try to find out what the position is around that, because it must be a huge challenge.
Mark, we're connected on LinkedIn. I'll reach out to you afterwards. Thank you very much for that. It's appreciated. Thanks. So I'm slightly conscious of time. We're at 5:10. We'll finish sharp at 5:30. I'm going to let Jennifer Barth, who is OpenUK's Chief Research Officer, take the stage and take you through the report that we published last week, a lot of which was simply sharing some of the work that Aviya and Andreas have explained to you today, bringing everybody up to date with the content of what's been going on, aggregated in one place, and obviously designed to support our open manifesto. If you haven't signed up to the manifesto, do please take a look and see if you feel that you're able to sign up if you're based in the UK. And one of the three asks, of course, is AI openness, which is explored in our report. Jen, can I let you share your screen?
Sure. Can you see?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. So as Amanda already introduced me, and I'll move right along, I am the Chief Research Officer at OpenUK and also the Research Director at Symmetry. So we've recently put out the Open Manifesto report alongside the Open Manifesto that's been presented to, or will be presented to, the Labour government. Of course, this came out on 3rd of July, on the eve of the big election, in a slightly different political moment than we have now. So it's very exciting where we are. What we did was organize a report around the manifesto's 3 asks. So the OpenUK manifesto's 3 asks: building skills in open source software, enabling the UK public sector to do open source software better, and AI openness, which we've had a great conversation about. today. And as Amanda said, many of the ideas, and including Andreas's work, are all, and a bit about Mozilla's role in the Columbia convening, are all in the report if you take a look, in either thought leadership pieces, fireside chats, case studies of things that are going on. But we organized the report around these three areas, and we drew from data that we've had in the past, updating that data to represent where we are today. So on skills, our sort of main asks are develop hands-on experience through open source software contribution, make individual experience visible, and make those working in open source software in the open source world open to international job opportunities. Of course, we always focus our reports on the UK. You can't talk about the UK without speaking globally, but we do focus as much as we can because there has been and there continues to be a lack of prominent data specifically on the UK, and there even still is the EU, including the UK in a lot of the data, which is great, but we try to pull it apart to show you what we can about the UK. So we have 3.6 million GitHub accounts as of June 2024, and that's up from 3.27, I believe. Sorry, I've just forgotten because I can't see my notes. This per capita,
it was 3. I'm going to narrate about these things. It's 3.2 million in January, which was the 4.7. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. So the 4.7 is the 3.2 from January. That's per capita percentage of the UK population with a GitHub account. And that's been updated to 5% in June. And when I say June, I mean by the 1st of June, 2024, that our data is that current. So we're up to 5% per capita percentage of UK population, and that's the highest per capita percentage. So UK-based contributors by commits ever made. Again, we've updated this. Our last round showed up to Q4 in 2023. There's this 32.5. And then you can see Q1 2024 and Q2 2024. So we're up from 33.3 and 34.1. All numbers are trending upwards. And we show the breakdown across different levels of commits. So the 34.1 thousand are 1+ commits, and then we work all the way to 834 1,000+ commits, up from 763. So really nice numbers broken out there by the commit levels. All of this data, by the way, has been done for us by Runa Capital. It's there, the logo, and Runa Capital's been fantastic working with us, creating a dashboard and a kind of constant update around these sort of numbers, scraping, of course, from GitHub. This was a slightly different way we looked at the issue around skills, and that's the IOM's recent World Migration Report in 2024. And we just pulled out one piece of data. There's obviously lots of data in this. It's not digital skills or tech sector or open source focus, but it is about the movement of people. So UK immigration versus emigration, 5 million immigrants into the UK and 3 million out of the UK. But broader conversation around this issue around immigration and emigration is that rising unemployment rates, particularly in the Northeast and East Midlands, and decreasing job vacancies is leading to the need to think more and more about international jobs. So I think there's a couple of things here. On the one hand, we need to think about becoming visible to international jobs, which allows more income into regions like the Northeast and East Midlands, who are often detached from the Southeast and London, where most of the jobs are and where most of the money is. And it allows money into those regions. It allows ideas into those regions. It helps to promote a sort of regional growth of innovation across resources and creative ideas in different areas. So we really wanted to show this kind of movement of people, ideas, money, resources into these areas with these decreasing job vacancies across the UK. And the stat is like 400,000 jobs down over the last, I think, 2 years. But also the UK is a destination for 601,000 mobile students, and that's just below about 800,000 in the US. So again, welcoming students. And we see a kind of difficulty there where they've made it, unless you're a master's student or you have a particular government-based scholarship to study in the UK, you cannot bring your family with you to the UK anymore as a student if you're an undergrad. And some of those changes, just changing the way in which people may or may not want to come to the UK to do these things, or how we can support people and their families in growing their resource base. And the other piece is the 2023 Global Skills sort of global talent visa, which has been replaced by excellent talent, the sort of another talent visa, but brings people in around digital skills, technological skills, also other areas as well, but also has some constraints around whether or not you can bring your family. So changing migration, changing visas, changing job unemployment rates and vacancies, and just the nature of what's happening. We want to make those who are working in open source to open to international jobs. So that visibility is really important. Moving on to the public sector and enabling the public sector, we are calling for good open source curation, world-leading policy and procedures, and a public sector environment that invests in the infrastructure, resources, and communities of open source. We've long been having this conversation about where the government is going with their open source configurations, really, and infrastructure. So embracing open source aligns with government digital transformation goals, driving better public services, fostering a culture of continuous improvement. We are seeing that in government spaces. By leveraging open source, the UK public sector can address complex challenges more effectively, so they can be robust, scalable, secure digital infrastructure that supports economic resilience and growth. So again, from Runa Capital, we tried to look across just public sector repositories at 1st of June 2024, and this was quite a new area that we were looking into. We found 1,780 repos, 14,910 stars, and 745,000 commits. We looked specifically at the Inspect AI repo and the framework for large language model evaluations, and found 369 stars up to 1st of June. Of course, a year ago, there was none, and that just shows it's been created in this last year. And our third piece is AI openness. Of course, it's been covered really nicely today in this show and tell, but democratizing AI enables innovation, appropriate safeguards and transparency, and become a leader in AI safety. So we've shown some of these numbers around UK AI repositories back in February, and we've updated to 1st of June 2024, and we find that there's 11 UK AI repositories in the UK with 1,000 plus stars just in the last 6 months. So if we had 14 in 2023 overall, we're already well on our way to having more for 2024, which is really exciting. I always love this sort of big spike we see in 2017 where it goes up to 19, and the big spike in discussions around AI in a different place and a different way of thinking about it at that time, now with Gen AI, but you can see the response in the open source world around the conversation around AI and the space to allow that in and moving forward. And then just as a total, of course, we had 91 in 2023, and that's at the end of 2023, and 6 months in, we have 102. My final slide here is just UK contributors who made at least one commit to any AI repository by the 1st of June 2024 with 1,000 plus stars was 2,310. And I just put in the right side to show how that's grown. So the last time we reported this, we were at December 2023, the end of 2023, at 2,133, went up by March in the next quarter, 2,239, and now 2,310. That's really all I wanted to say. We are promoting, and I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning around the three pieces: building skills in open source software. We're committed, OpenUK is committed to that, not just in this conversation around manifesto, but we put out a skills report. We want to bring visibility to the people and the places and the ways in which people are working in the open source software world, often unrecognized. We have, often undercompensated, and how do we bring them forward to allow the international job market to see them. Enabling the UK public sector to do open source software better. We've had lots of public sector commitment and conversation, and OpenUK has been at the forefront of having this conversation with the public sector, but also seeing the way gov.uk has used it, the way different councils are taking open source on, but it's also a broader understanding of what needs to be there in order to support the infrastructure. How do you create a procedure base where this can be supported, and a conversation where this is highlighted as a major part of holding up the UK in general. And lastly,
Jen, just jumping in there, and we've only got a few minutes left, just focusing on that AI piece a little bit more. We have in the report a piece from Andreas summarizing the work that they've done. We have a fireside chat with Mozilla on the Columbia convening, going into a little bit more detail about that. We also have an update on the AI Act, which of course is now out of date with the AI Act coming out today, but which was pretty useful, I think, just to give context at the stages it was going through, from Margaret Hartnett. And we'll get Margaret to do something else in the next week or so with more detail that we'll share publicly as a little bit of update. She's very, very good on the technical side of that AI Act and has really been following the granular detail the whole way through. We also have taken a piece of work where we are not only, this is our third report on AI, trying to aggregate what the market is doing, but also we have taken some time to try and explain, almost mark the conversation you and I had briefly about, what does the OSI do? What is open source? In order that we have that clear for people coming to the report who are from outside the world of open source, who are coming in at the sort of entry point of trying to create policy around AI. I can also share a link to a piece I had published in the New Stack about not banning open source. And Aviya mentioned that there have been calls for open source AI to be banned. And it's something that I have also seen in the UK at a policy level, particularly to politicians. And I'm super keen to make sure that we are, sort of united as a community and well informed about what's going on, but also sharing across the regulatory landscape and to the policy people the right information so that they're informed. And we've done, I think, was it last July and then January and now this July, 3 pieces around contextualizing that and bringing everybody up to date on what's happening in the discussion in the marketplace, I think.
One thing that I think is useful about this report, if you have the time to look at it or if you want to share it, is that it really lays out more than I think any report we've done yet, the key issues we're talking about, not just on AI and openness, AI, but also openness. Because of the pieces like from Andreas, there's a bit of a conversation there around what does openness mean? What does proprietary mean? What does closed mean? I think it's one of the best pieces of just bringing everyone to a place of understanding. I think it's quite difficult, and there's a lot of different ways. And something we've been dealing with is, now we're at AI openness, but it took a while to get that. And it, talking about open and then AI and all of the kind of things around how that narrative comes to be. And I think this report really clarifies a lot of things. So it's a good one to share with people if you're like, if you just feel like you need to explain and get people up to a certain understanding. I think this report does that, and it doesn't assume you would already know upon entering it, because it lays out what the issues are in a way that allows people to grasp it. So I think it's an important one. We also take all of our case studies, thought leadership, and fireside chats, and we bite-size them onto the website. So that's another place to get or to go look at the ones we've done in the past as well, and the way different organizations, and we've looked across public sector, we've looked across the NHS, we've looked across lots of different companies and people, and had great contribution from people working in this area over the last couple of years. And that's all on the website now, which also gives you a nice baseline of the conversation. You're on mute, Amanda.
Sorry, rookie error. I think we've had some really good people contribute in that time, and I'm sure we'll have many more, which sort of brings me back to the group today. If anybody who is on this call has suggestions for pieces of work that we should be looking at as we are trying to analyze what's in the market, as Mark already has flagged that to us, please do flag. And if you're aware of any great open AI, and I mean it in the true sense, case studies or use cases that you think we ought to be speaking to, even if they're beyond the UK, but if there are folk in the UK in particular that we ought to be speaking to, we can really help to raise the profile of their work. In our research, we really crunch what's going on in GitHub, both from a skills perspective and an AI perspective. And we were able to find AutoGPT in the UK long before most people realized that it was a UK repo and a UK founder that was producing it. So it's been a really great way for bringing transparency and engagement. So if anybody has any suggestions, we're really open to those. It'd be super helpful. Any final comments or questions? I appreciate that it's almost 5:30. Any questions for Jen, or any final comments or questions for the group? In that case, what I should do is reshare my screen very quickly. Thank you, Jen. To remind everybody that our State of Open reporting survey is also open until the 8th of September. I couldn't answer it. You have to be the right person in the right company, which means you have to be somebody who understands what's happening in your company from an engineering and economic perspective. But it gives us a really deep insight into what's happening in the market that others don't have. And it gives us a really good way of valuing data. You've probably seen that Harvard did some valuation this year, some valuation of open source based on value generated rather than cost of replacement. And it's the first time they've done it. We've been doing it for 3-4 years now. The data that they've used is commercial data, and it's not data that can be replicated by doing a survey or anything else. So we're really keen to make sure that we keep evolving this open work and getting your data. So if anybody can do the survey or share it with somebody they know who could, then really appreciate it. Reminder, 20th of September for our next show and tell. And thank you very much for joining us. We will tidy it up and share the video content from today, which is a superb presentation or set of presentations. Really appreciate it. And we will also be sharing early next week the video content from the report launch, which includes Andreas, Neil Lawrence, and many others. So looking forward to sharing those with you. And thank you all for joining us today and for your patience with the technical hitches. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.